The world is full of strange crimes that happen every single day, but some of them, they go way beyond strange. And these are the cases that make you sit back and ask, how is this even real? Now, some of them end in justice, others are destined to remain a mystery, but every single one is unforgettable. Welcome to Scary Mysteries. Here are 5 murder mysteries so twisted they don't seem real. Number 5. What happened to Eric? It was just after dawn on June 26th of 1983 when Lyle Cross was about to step outside his home in Vicksburg, Michigan, when he heard the screeching of tires and a loud muffler outside. When he got out towards the end of his driveway, he looked to see who it was speeding off, but they were too far out of sight by then. He then picked up his newspaper like he always had, and that's when he saw it. The body of a young man lying sprawled out along the edge of the road. He was battered, barefoot, and bloodied. Lyle rushed over, and that's when he realized the kid who was gravely injured was his own son, 17-year-old Eric. The summer was officially here, and it was the end of the school year. So the night before this tragic morning, Eric had headed out to a graduation party, but clearly he never made it home safely. And at first, police treated it like a classic hit-and-run case. However, once the medical examiner got to look him over, it was clear this was no accident. Eric had been hit, likely by a car, yes, but also dragged. There were just too many injuries to be consistent with a single hit. Eric had undeniable scrapes, marks indicating he may have been tied to or even trapped under the vehicle. Some injuries, like multiple blunt force hits to the head, then suggested he'd been beaten before that. And whatever happened, it wasn't just an accident. It was staged to look like one. The authorities started to think that maybe he had been beaten up. Maybe it went too far, and whoever did it, dropped him in front of his house and then hit him with a car to make it look like a hit and run. And the reason he was dragged was because, unlike a normal person who would have been standing upright when they got hit, Eric was lying down already, unconscious, or even dead. The rumors started up immediately. The police talked to kids from the party, or at least they tried to, but lips were pretty tight around who saw what. What they did learn, though, was Eric had reportedly gotten into an argument with a group of teens while there. And he was also highly intoxicated, as several mentioned, so he was sort of getting messed around with. And some said it was more than messing around and that he was being harassed, and people throwing beer on him, stealing his shoes. It was sort of teens being teens, but maybe at some point it all went too far. Ultimately, the authorities hit a dead end in their pursuit on this angle, but the townsfolk knew something bad went down and wanted justice. Years passed and Eric's case went cold, but his sister, Jackie, never gave up. She pushed for answers, organized rallies, and got the community involved.
Thank you so much. Thank you for everything you're doing with them and everything.
Yeah.
And for being here tonight. That was so encouraging.
By the mid-2010s, the case was back under the microscope. A group of 5 individuals, now adults, were identified by investigators as persons of interest. Brenton Spaulding, his father Brian, Amber Thomas, Tim Martin, and Bill Cook. The sheriff's department believed they were involved, and in 2017, they even submitted warrants for charges. But then, nothing. And too much time had passed, and there just wasn't enough evidence. As to why those 5 got picked, well, the prevailing theory as to what went down is that Eric was either abducted or ambushed as he tried to make his way home. And he only lived about a mile away and had walked to the party alone, so it made sense that he would have walked back. Then kids from the party happened to pass by and decided to mess with him some more. He may have been forced into a vehicle or beaten first, and then, either in a twisted act of cruelty, they hit him with the car, possibly not even knowing they had killed him. Either that or they hit him to cover up what they had done once they realized they had all gone too far. Despite local efforts, annual marches, billboards, online campaigns, no one has ever stood trial. And as of now, the case remains open.
I'd like it to be settled and to be over with, and so that we can all go back and just live our life peacefully, without revenge and without bitterness.
Number 4, the Killer Cobbler. This one starts with a boy, not the kind you'd expect to end up on a killing spree, but the one forced to survive in a basement, chained up like an animal, whipped until his skin split open by the very people who adopted him. Maybe that's the real horror in this story. Because before Joseph Callinger became known as the Shoemaker, before the torture and the bloodshed, he was a child, abused, broken. By the time the world took notice, it was already far too late. And Joseph was born in the winter of 1935 in Philadelphia. And his biological parents abandoned him at just 2 years old. When he was 4, he was adopted by Stephen and Anna Callinger, 2 people who, by every definition, were monsters behind closed doors. And they burned him with irons, locked him in closets, forced him to kneel on jagged rocks for hours. It was horrific, and so by his teenage years, Joseph was already showing signs of severe psychological damage. But somehow, despite it all, he would go on to find stability as he got older, at least outwardly. He married, had children, ran a shoe repair shop in Philadelphia. But stability is a fleeting thing when your mind's unraveling. And Joseph had 7 children from 2 wives. And just like his adoptive parents before him, he became a tyrant in his own home. He starved his kids, locked them in closets, and even performed what he called punishment surgeries, using scissors, needles, and a lighter. And by 1972, it was so bad that 5 of the kids went to the authorities together and told them everything their dad was doing. Joseph was brought in, and he was then diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia during the investigation and evaluated as in need of psychiatric supervision. But then, the children suddenly recanted, likely out of fear, and the charges were dropped. It was a big missed opportunity, as we would all find out very soon. Because just 2 years later, Callinger would recruit someone to help him take that violence outside the home. It was his 12-year-old son, Michael. In 1974, Joseph began hearing voices that he claimed were from God. He believed he'd been chosen to cleanse the world through pain and suffering. And as such, between July of 74 and January of 75, Joseph and Michael went on a twisted cross-state crime spree, spanning Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland. And they would knock on doors pretending to be salesmen or building inspectors. And once they got inside, they pulled weapons and tied up families, and they unleashed their brutality. In one case, they tortured a woman with a heated coat hanger. In another, they held children hostage while Joseph lectured the parents on morality and sin. In January of 75, the two broke into a home in Leonia, New Jersey. While holding the family hostage, a nurse named Maria Fashing unexpectedly walked in. And when she refused to obey the man's orders and allow herself to be tied up, Joseph stabbed her to death in the neck and back, right there in front of everyone. He was only 21 years old. In total, the duo is linked to 3 murders and at least 4 home invasions, and Joseph and Michael were caught less than 2 weeks later. Police found blood-stained clothing, matching eyewitness descriptions, even connected Joseph to the mysterious death of his own son, Joseph Jr., who had died a few years prior under suspicious circumstances. And he had tried to collect a large life insurance policy off his own child's death, but they never paid him out. The story as to what happened to Junior never made sense, and now it was clear why. During the trial, Michael was viewed as a victim of his father's manipulation, and he testified against his dad and was eventually released after serving time in juvie. And Joseph, on the other hand, was sentenced to life in prison in October of '76. Once inside the jail, the chaos never ended. And Callinger set himself on fire multiple times, smeared feces on his cell walls, and a whole bunch of other things. He was transferred to a psychiatric facility and remained there until March 26th of '96, when he died of heart failure in Crescent State Correctional Institution. He was 60 years old.
At the end of murdering all the people on earth, I was going to murder my own family and then take my own life and become God.
Number 3, the Stalking Strangler. Carlton Gary was born into chaos on September 24th of 1950 in Columbus, Georgia. His father wanted nothing to do with him. His mother could barely feed him, so his early childhood was a mix of moving around from place to place, just surviving. By the time he was in elementary school, Gary had suffered a head injury, one that left him unconscious, and some say it left permanent damage, as he was never quite the same after this. As a teen, he spiraled into drugs and crime that included arson, assault, and robbery. And looking to change his ways, he moved to New York in 1970 to chase his big dreams of being a singer. Instead, though, as that slowly didn't pan out, he instead became a suspect in a string of attacks against elderly women. The first confirmed killing came on February 12th of 1970. The 62-year-old Marion Brewer was found having been essayed and strangled in her Albany hotel room. Then, just 2 months later, 85-year-old Nellie Farmer was discovered murdered in a nearly identical fashion, this time at the Wellington Hotel. Both crime scenes were very similar and had occurred in the exact same city. When Gary was arrested for attempting another assault soon after, a single fingerprint there linked him to the Farmer scene. But Gary didn't get charged with murder. Instead, he cut a deal and testified against an alleged accomplice, a man named John Mitchell. Mitchell and him, he said, were there to rob the place, which he took part of, but the murder, well, that was all John, which was good enough for the courts. There was no physical evidence tying him to the murder, but John still took the rap for it. And Gary, meanwhile, was convicted only of robbery and sent off to serve only a few years. After his release in '75, he then popped up in Syracuse, New York, looking for a fresh start, and wouldn't you know it, within days, 2 more elderly women were attacked. One of them died, and the surviving victim described a black man with a mustache. But in the same breath, she said it was dark and couldn't be too sure who it was, and ultimately no charges in either of those cases stuck, though Gary was soon rearrested for selling stolen goods and sent back behind bars for that. In '77, while serving time at a low-security prison, Gary sawed through the bars of his cell and escaped. He made his way back this time to Columbus, Georgia, and that's when the real nightmare began. In just 7 months' time, from September of '77 to April of '78, at least 7 elderly women were assaulted and strangled in their homes across the surrounding county. Most were white, and most lived alone, and most were killed with their own stockings or scarves. The city was paralyzed with fear. Women taped down their windows. A killer was clearly targeting the elderly, and police believed he was African American. But then a strange twist. A man calling himself the chairman of the forces of evil sent taunting letters to the authorities, threatening to kill black women if the so-called Stalking Strangler wasn't stopped. In other words, if the police were going to keep letting white women die, then he was going to even the score in his twisted mind. And twisted it was, because as it turns out, those letters came from William Hance, a black man who had already killed 3 women and was now trying to use the letters to pass it off like the crimes had been committed by some white vigilantes. Police brought him in and thought they had finally nabbed the Stalking Strangler, but while in custody, another elderly woman was strangled and murdered. By the time police caught up with Gary in '84, detectives had their suspicions that he might be the real Strangler, or at least that they could pin it on him. By '86, he was then tried and convicted for 3 of the Columbus murders, and the jury sentenced him to death for that, But for years, a chorus of voices insisted Gary was innocent. Not of everything, but of the murders that sent him to death row. They pointed out glaring issues. And the supposed confession he gave, well, it was never recorded.
Admits to the police officers his participation at the very time the murder occurred. He admits it to the police.
There were no notes even. The statement was written by an officer days later from his memory. The only living survivor who positively identified Gary, well, had also previously ID'd 3 other men. And evidence about DNA and bite mark impressions and shoe prints, all of which could have excluded Gary, was never shown to the jury. In fact, one of the clearest pieces of physical evidence was a shoe print found at a crime scene. It was a size 10 and Gary wore a size 13.5. DNA testing conducted decades later linked Gary to just one of the Columbus victims, yet he was convicted of all 3. On March 15th of 2018, he was executed by lethal injection in Georgia. So was justice served. Well, Carlton almost certainly committed terrible crimes. There's no denying that. At least 2 confirmed murders are tied to his DNA. But did he kill all 7 women in Columbus? The answer depends on who you ask and whether you trust the evidence withheld, mishandled, or just ignored. Number 2, the bloody reign of the Pettingill family. All across the globe, there's a criminal underworld in every major city, one that most of us regular folks don't know too much about. Sometimes they're made up of family members that work together. More notable names are the Gambinos or the Colombos. Well, down in Melbourne, Australia, they do things a little differently. The Pettingills down there were known for the usual stuff: contract killings, executions of cops, and drug running. Only this family was run by a one-eyed matriarch named Kathleen, aka Granny Evil. The Queen Pin herself was born in 1935. She spent her early years working the streets, but eventually she became a mother. 1, 2, 3 kids, and when she was finished, she had 10 in total. Her oldest son, Dennis Allen, went by a fitting nickname, Mr. Death. He wasn't just a drug kingpin operating out of Richmond in the 1980s. He was also suspected in the deaths of up to 15 people. A known sadist, Dennis ruled with brutality, using his heroin addiction as both a tool and a weapon. He was able to get people to let their guard down around him, as years of abuse left him thin and sickly looking. But make no mistake about it, he was vicious. In 1985, he dismembered a Hell's Angel biker with a chainsaw because he owed him some money. And he avoided conviction for years through bribes and intimidation. That is, until 1987, when his heart finally gave out at the age of 35 while he was awaiting trial for murder. But even in death, he took secrets that likely could have taken others down with him. And Victor Pierce, Kath's 6th child, became the face of the family's most controversial and high-profile crime, the Wall Street police shootings. In 1988, 2 young officers who were just 20 and 22 years old were gunned down in a trap designed to look like a car theft. It was a setup, though. At the time, there was a high number of armed robberies in the area that the Pettingills and others were involved in. With police cracking down, this was just their way of showing the authorities who was really in charge. Victor, his brother Trevor, and 2 others were charged with the murders. But at trial, the star witness, Victor's longtime partner, Wendy Pierce, refused to testify. Without her, the prosecution had nothing, so all 4 men walked. But in 2005, Wendy finally broke her silence, telling reporters that Victor did help plan and carry out the ambush. By then, though, Victor was already dead, gunned down in his car in broad daylight in Port Melbourne in 2002, and part of the bloody fallout from the city's gangland wars. And then there was Peter Allen, and Kath's second oldest son and another violent player in the family business. He built a heroin empire so lucrative, bought him a mansion in Lower Templestowe. Authorities took it back when he was arrested under the Proceeds of Crime Act, but it didn't stop him. And Peter kept dealing from behind bars and became the jailhouse lawyer of the family, known for manipulating the system like a pro. And he served 28 years for armed robbery and assault before finally being released in 2002. And not all of Kath's children lived to an old age. Jamie Pettingill, born in 1963, died at just 21 from a heroin overdose. He had reportedly been involved in an armed robbery not long before his death. And Vicky Brooks, Kath's oldest daughter, eventually turned her back on the family and entered into witness protection. And she became the first to publicly denounce the criminal empire from within, offering damning testimony that exposed her relatives' criminal networks. But through it all, the one constant was Kath, the one-eyed matriarch who never pulled a trigger herself, but orchestrated the rise of a family empire built on blood, drugs, and cold-blooded crime. Even now, long after many of her children have died, been killed, or faded into the background, her legacy lingers in Australia's criminal folklore. From a brothel worker in the 1950s to the most feared woman in Melbourne's underworld, she didn't just raise children, she raised criminals. And in doing so, she created a terrifying bloodline of utter chaos. Number 1. Disciples of Destruction. Mount Vernon, New Hampshire. Just another quiet town with tree-lined streets, white picket fences, and porches where nothing ever seemed to go wrong. But in the early hours of October 4th of 2009, something terrifying and unexpected happened. Something that really could happen to any of us at any time. A random home invasion that had nothing to do with a robbery or revenge. It was all about fun, and the killers were just a couple of teens. Kimberly Cates was a 42-year-old nurse and mother of one. She was well known around town, kind and devoted to her family. And that night, she was asleep in her bed, her 11-year-old daughter Jamie asleep beside her. That's when 4 young men crept silently through the woods nearby, crossed over the lawn, and slipped into the home right through an unlocked door. The ringleader was 17-year-old Stephen Spader, a former high school student with a craving for violence. And this small-town life wasn't right for him. No, he was dark and twisted, and he wanted to let everyone know. So he created a club called DOD, which was short for Disciples of Destruction. And it wasn't a joke or fantasy. To Spader, this was his identity. He then recruited a couple of followers, 19-year-old Christopher Gribble, a self-professed sociopath with delusions of grandeur, and 2 others, William Marks and Quinn Glover, who, while less hands-on, knew exactly what was about to happen. And they had picked the house at random, just a remote location with easy access. The plan was simple, an initiation into the club of sorts. Break in, kill whoever was inside, and become brothers in blood. Armed with machetes and a knife, Spader and Gribble made their way to the master bedroom. What happened next is almost too brutal to describe. And Kimberly was hacked to death, sustaining over 30 wounds, most of them to her head, neck, and torso. Her daughter Jamie woke up from the screams and was also brutally struck, machete wounds slicing through her chest and head. Miraculously, she survived by playing dead.
She remains in the intensive care unit in stable condition. It doesn't appear that her injuries are life-threatening.
The killers then fled off into the night laughing. They bagged up their weapons, burned their clothes, and met back in one of their homes where they boasted about what they had done. Spader was even said to have recorded details of the murder in his journal, proudly referring to it as the most exhilarating thing he had ever done. And he wasn't trying to really get away with it either. He wanted to be feared. The investigation moved quickly. Young Jamie, despite suffering nearly fatal injuries, gave police a crucial description, enough to start pointing fingers. Word got out fast in the small community, and soon whispers turned into confessions. Autumn Savoy, another friend of the group, admitted they had helped the boys hide evidence, and then the dam broke. Within days, all four were arrested. Spader and Gribble confessed in detail, almost like they were recounting a movie they had just seen. At trial, Spader sat in the courtroom, smiling at times, completely detached. He called himself the most sick and twisted person you'll ever meet, and the jury agreed. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and attempted murder, sentenced to life without parole, plus 76 years. Gribble, he received the same. Their accomplices, Marks and Glover, received prison terms of 30 to 60 and 20 to 40 years, respectively. Autumn got 5 to 12 years for obstruction. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that mandatory life sentences for juveniles were unconstitutional. It sparked a wave of resentencing hearings, including one for Spader. But in a twist, Spader rejected the chance. And he told the court he wanted to stay in prison and didn't care about freedom. In the letter, he wrote, "I'm not sorry for what I did. I'm sorry that I got caught." So there were 5 murders so twisted they don't seem real. That's a wrap for today's episode. And if you liked it, we got a whole bunch of other podcasts and videos, so go around and enjoy a good binge on us. Thanks so much for tuning in to Scary Mysteries. Stay safe out there. I'll see you guys over in the next one.